Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Minister Chun. Thank you, Minister Sapin, for a great insight on the subject. So this has definitely ignited a lot of ideas and questions in my mind. And I guess it's the same with the audience. So the way we are actually going to take this forward is I will start the discussion, but at the same time, I'll encourage the audience to keep your questions ready, and we'll get you involved in the conversation. So make sure that when you are asking questions to give your name, the institute or the organization you represent, and to whom you would like to address this question. And try to keep it to one question per person so that everybody get a chance. Okay? So on that note, let me start. So I was trying to do a word cloud, which means the most spoken word by all the 4 speakers. The one word which actually stood out was globalization. Okay? And I call myself a child of globalization. I was born in a small town in India, studied in a big city, working in Singapore, managing Asia-Pac business for an American company. Okay. So this is a good example, and I'm not an exception, but a lot of people are part of the same story. Okay. So now the whole concept of globalization is under threat. The first thing I would like to find out, starting with you, Minister Chun, is globalization, the threat to globalization, a fad, or is actually a trend which you see is emerging?
Hey, good morning. Don't think globalization is the problem in the sense that all these problems are brought about by globalization. Globalization is a big word, but the essence of globalization is to allow each and every country and their respective people to leverage on their strengths to produce goods, services that are better for the world. And we can do this through greater connectivity, trade, services, and now the digital platform. The real problem is not globalization per se. The real problem is how do we manage the consequential adjustments needed in globalization. Because when economies integrate, it will inevitably require adjustments at the local level. When the local adjustments fail, either because we don't have the political will or the political capacity, it will cause a local backlash with global consequences. We see this in the UK, we see this in the US and many other places. I don't think that the people in UK do not understand the benefits of globalization. They do. But they do not see the benefits being distributed in the way they aspire towards or they hope for. Why is it that the people in London voted overwhelmingly to stay in Europe, whereas the people, many people in the Midlands voted to get out of Europe? Because the two groups did not benefit equally through this process. Then the question is, does the UK government has the means and the political will to help those who have lost out absolutely or relatively to make those adjustments? And it goes beyond the issue of just redistribution. If it's just redistribution, it's a relatively simple concept. Tax the Londoners to pay off the people outside London. Now that is a static redistribution concept. But that doesn't answer the deeper issue and the deeper fears of the people in the Midlands. That will I be able to survive on my own steed instead of relying on an uncertain political redistribution exercise? And that requires a tremendous effort to provide the people who have been displaced with the new skill sets that they can have confidence in to earn them a living. While this may seem very far away from Singapore, it is not that far from Singapore. Even in Singapore, as a small society, globalization will bring with it necessary disruption and adjustments to our people, to our industries. And this is the reason why the Singapore government has spent so much effort to emphasize the retraining of our people, to make sure that they have the skills for tomorrow, and to spend so much effort to upgrade our industries to integrate to the new global supply chain. As a small country, we are price takers. We cannot tell the world what to do, but we can help our own industries adjust and adjust quickly to the demands of the world. I used to be the labor movement chief, or the union chief as they call it. You will be quite surprised that in Singapore, the labor chief can become the Minister for Trade and Industry. We have a saying that many countries try to put today's unemployed into today's jobs. Some countries try to put today's unemployed into tomorrow's job. Our challenge in Singapore is to put tomorrow's unemployed into tomorrow's job ahead of time. What we try to do is no different from what many other countries do. We are lucky that we still have a strong tripartite relationship that allow us to do this, where we have the support of the businesses, the unions, and the government. But it's not to be taken for granted. I realize how unnatural this is, because in many countries, when the crisis struck, the tripartite relationship, including in many European countries, fragment. The political center fragment, and it goes on a downward spiral, because once the political center fragment, there can be no strong leadership to take charge of the situation and to hold the country together and make those difficult decisions. And then with the rise of populist, narrow-casting media, you will find a very different outcome, where the society will continue to fragment, looking for easy solutions. So I don't think that we should blame everything on globalization, but we all have a responsibility to understand the consequences of globalization and the consequential adjustments that we need to help our people and industries adjust. If we don't do that, then I don't think we can claim that globalization will benefit everyone or every society.
Before I come to Minister Sapin, there's just a follow-up question I want to ask. So you talk about the reskill as one of the biggest things which the government can do to solve the problem. Okay? So do you think it's also the issue of where people managing their own expectation, where they have to really step up, and it's not only the government which has to step up?
Of course, it's two-sided. The government must do what we can to organize our education and training systems to continuously upgrade the skills of our workers so that they have the means and the confidence to acquire the jobs of the future. But just as in any country, in every country, the workers will also have to play their part by making sure that they understand the challenges and the opportunities that comes with the new disruption, the new economy. But very often, the problem is this. Instead of painting a future that says, if we all train, get ourselves new skills, if we all train ourselves better, get ourselves new skills, we will be able to seize these opportunities. Now, this is one political conversation. You can have another political conversation is, vote me in, I will defend your jobs. I will make sure that the jobs doesn't change, and we'll live happily ever after. And if we can close the door and keep out the barbarians, even better. That is another political conversation. The first one is a difficult one. It takes political courage and guts to tell people the truth, that we cannot just close the doors and keep out the barbarians and try to live happily ever after, and definitely not for a small country. But it takes guts to do so. It takes courage for everyone to go on that journey together. And in the process, to be able to redistribute some of the gains to take care of those who have tried but are unable to keep pace. The other route that we can take is a populist route that is easy, and it may sound rather attractive to many as well. But you see, this thing can easily spiral out of control because it depends on a strong political center where you are able to galvanize the public opinion to say that let's go this way because it is a correct way. It might be harder, but it will lead to a better outcome. But that is where you distinguish between politicians and political leaders.
Thank you. Minister Sapin, so if I can actually come to you. Nationalism across the world is on the rise. Okay? And we also spoke about how globalization actually helped us to be where we are right now. Okay. Do you think there is a case that the globalization will be a losing battle because of the rise of nationalism? Or do you think globalization will actually win?
I'll try to find a few words on what I have in mind. It is comparable to what you have in Singapore in terms of the world, but we have seen that we have benefited from for a long time taking the opportunities of this globalization. But there are other countries. It's true for the older countries, those countries that knew high growth outside the globalization that are now within globalization, and then ask themselves the question, because today it's a very important question, because what is most complicated is the question of the sense. We have a sense. What is sense? What is the sense of globalization? What is the meaning of globalization for the French people, for example? What is the meaning of globalization for the American people? What is the meaning of globalization for Minister Modération, as you mentioned it earlier on, for example, for the British people? And this question of meaning of sense is the most complicated question in politics, because it's not to give a perspective, but also to give hope, but also to see that people believe in this perspective, because we can believe in this hope. And in this is why we have the biggest problems, because I will give you an example, which is, I think it's quite good. Despite the nationalism, is the Eurozone, for example. If today we have a Eurozone in Europe, which is very strong, which is very powerful, which is very united, is the one that is built around one currency. And the last few years, I think about Greece, maybe you think about other countries as well, is various countries that ask themselves, do we stay with the euro or do we leave euro? And what won with the people is because they wanted to have one currency that gave them safety and security and stability. And this unique money in the countries that are part of the united with the euro have a very deep meaning. It's a very important aspect of it's because the problem with the British people is that they were not part of euro, they didn't have it. So I could say the same thing about, for example, Italy, or where the populism or nationalism is very strong, where it could create instability, for example, and also raise a lot of questions in terms of economy. And but the element which brings everybody together is the question of what we have towards the unique currency, the European currency, which was a very difficult thing to put in place, which has a real meaning. And to understand this meaning of the euro, and a lot of people do not understand what is the meaning of that, of globalization. So it is an effort which is a political effort. Yes, because the leaders have, in all countries, it's a necessity to put into place. And I really share your preoccupation and your enthusiasm on training and ongoing training, and then for young people, for old people, to adapt to new jobs and to new things without telling them that they may keep their jobs in the future and so on and so forth. But because of new technology. But it's very true, because there is a big problem, and I see that in countries that work very well in democracy, like in the US, in the UK, or in Europe, we see that there is a majority of the people who do not understand, who do not want, who are against. We see that we see that what's happening in the UK, because you have people who are for and people and nobody is for anything really. But it is what we feel, and it is the reason, to answer your question, I know that globalization, if we leave, for one of whichever country want to leave, or create borders or walls, it would be a loss for everybody. It would be a loss of capacity to create new richness, and it would be also a big danger for the weakest ones, because they would really lose a lot. but it's not easily shared. And the simple solutions are not there. Simple solutions are, of course, easier to be shared. And so therefore we have a responsibility, all of us, because globalization is for all of us, to give a new meaning to this globalization, not through a vision of a naive vision or to, it's not a belief, it's something which is rational. And to go against irrational behavior is not easy, and we need a lot of efforts to succeed.
Okay, now let me throw the floor open to the audience to ask question. So before I come back to my next, so anybody in the, okay, so can we have a mic?
My name is Katie Kwok. I'm a businessman in Singapore who has resided also in Europe. Like Minister Chun, I agree economics and politics are intertwined. My simple question is this. What, apart from inequality and immobility within a country, what if one country or one set of countries say to another country or another set of country that they are both at some form of economic conflict? In particular, the US and the EC vis-a-vis China, and closer to home, Singapore with its own neighbors around it. Thank you.
I think whether is it between two countries or two regional blocs, there will always be areas of contest and cooperation. The question is, even between the US and China, there will be area of contest and there will be areas of cooperation. The question is whether the US and the Chinese leadership in this particular example can see the greater picture to say that I have more areas in common, we have more in common, more interests in common than just the difficulties that we have. There will always be difficulties between any two regional blocs, two regional countries, whether it's Singapore with neighbors, France with other European neighbors, it will always be so. But it takes political courage to say that we have more in common, we have more in common to uphold, and then we try to manage the situations that as best as we can, so that it doesn't come into open conflict. My own hypothesis is the greater interdependence between countries and region, the smaller the probability of us coming to blows as in the past century where we have wars as the final arbiter of conflicts. So today the world is much more interlinked, there's much greater connectivity. Whatever happens in one part of the world has much greater repercussions on another part of the world. And I think we need to understand this changed reality. But it takes political courage for people to come up and say this and not to seize on isolated issues and politicize it to make it the be-all and end-all. Just take the US and China as an example. Of course, there's a competition over technology, there's competition over trade, and so forth. But I think the US and China also share great interest to make sure that we have a stable and progressive world system in the areas of economics, trade, finance, and so forth.
Okay, yeah, just let's take one more question.
Okay. Hey, good morning, ministers. My name is Chun. I'm a commentary writer from China, but based in Singapore. Many people say the US-China trade war is not good, but I think it's not so bad. Because of the war, China has been forced to reform and open further. As a result, many countries, including Singapore and France, can be the free riders of the US. Regarding this, do you think we should thank the game changer, President Trump? Thank you.
Sorry, what's your last sentence again, do you think?
Do you think we should thank Donald Trump? Actually, he's
Thank Donald Trump.
He's a game changer.
Do you want to thank Donald Trump for being the game changer?
I'm sure both President Donald Trump and President Xi Jinping are game changers in all sense of the words. Let me have a few data points. I don't think Asia will do very well hoping to collect the spoils of war, as you call it. I don't think that is the correct perspective. countries like Singapore, ASEAN, we need to develop our real capabilities to make sure that we can value add to the global production chain, the global value chain. It is very sad to hope for spoils of war. When the US and China collide, there are a few levels of implication. Of course, there's a tactical implication as to whether you buy a bit more from me, I sell a bit more to you. Those are what I call tactical implications at the small level, local level. But what it means at another level is that the global value chain and production chain will shift. And when the global value chains and production chains shift, every country from Asia to Europe have to ask ourselves, what part can we play in this shift in the global production chains? There will be some opportunities in some parts. There will be some challenges in others. But what is invariant is that every country will have to help its own people organize itself for the change. You cannot pretend that this will have no local impact on the respective countries. So that's the second level of impact. But there is a deeper level of impact which has far greater, far-reaching consequences. And that is, will the world lose confidence? Will investors lose confidence in the global economy? And because of that, people pull back their investments, and then we have quite a different outcome that is not so easily rectified. And that, I think, the third order effect will potentially overwhelm the first and second order effect. So I think we have to watch this very carefully. But regardless of the outcome, it is important for countries in Asia, Europe, to ask ourselves how we can integrate our economies, diversify our economies, to minimize the risk or the shocks of any untoward outcome. And it would not be the correct attitude to say that when the elephants fight, I wait for the spoils of war to come my way. It may never come.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, so just listening to all the conversations, as a child of globalization, a song of Beatles' song, of John Lennon's song, Imagine, came to my mind. And it says that imagine all the people sharing all the world. Imagine all the people living life in peace. Okay? So I want to imagine a scenario for both of you. I'll start with Minister Michel Sapin, that you have all the powers in the world to convene all the stakeholders into a room. And you have to give them one or two thoughts to solve the current gridlock we have in the global world. So what will be that one idea or one message you will give to the stakeholders if you have all the power to change?
For the Beatles could sing Imagine, and for the politicians it's a bit more difficult, so we can't really sing and obtain results. But I will try to put myself into the skin of the Beatles, and I will think about inequalities. Not because they are a new element in society today, because we learn a lot of inequalities, but some are a lot of mechanisms of risk distribution, as you mentioned. It works at one time, but one period, but various sharing or promotional mechanisms with one another, from the weakest to the strongest. And it really works on the long term. But of course, this is what our societies should aspire to or develop, especially in education, and also in training and professional training and ongoing professional training, and also the same way to share the evolution, the technological evolution and advancements, and especially in medicine as well, to be all equal towards health problems, health issues. But the reality of what is perceived today is that globalization of the last few years is a globalization that has increased inequalities in all the countries. So what we need to ask is efforts. And the people are ready to understand that efforts need to be made. But even though to those to whom we ask the biggest efforts, some that need to increase their knowledge to the ones that are the farthest behind, territorially, for example, or like a state like yours, for example, or in France, for example, where big countries that we have differences, geographical differences that are quite big. All these are able to understand that efforts are necessary, and they want that these efforts can bring them something, and not only to feel that these efforts bring something only to other people, but those who already have more benefits than others. So this question of inequalities is decisive, because I will tell you something. Because I'm not the first one to talk about inequalities, especially about globalization, but it is mentioned all over the world. But in particular, in IMF, at the IMF, in the International Monetary Fund, they have many people have participated into those meetings of the IMF. And last year, in one of the last sessions that I participated to the IMF in the spring session in 2017, April 2017, is the question of inequalities that was the biggest, the most important subject debated within the biggest people of the world. And someone in the room cited one sentence which had an impact, and this sentence was from Gramsci. Gramsci cited that in the IMF that, and against what you may think, that culture is political and economic is not spread out, or within those, not everybody had understood who he was talking about. We had to fight against inequality, so on and so forth. But suddenly someone said, but do you realize he was a Marxist? It was total silence. But what is happening? What is happening? We want this, and beyond this anecdote, this reflection on the power and the sharing of power and sharing of riches and wealth and a new sharing of the world that is being created is decisive today to find good solutions. Solutions are not systematically to take from the rich to give to the poor. We need to have a fiscal equality or balance, but the answers could be from another nature. And this question is decisive. If today Donald Trump has a big success or had a huge success, it's because a biggest part of the U.S. in the middle felt outside, not able to benefit from this changing in globalization, and that was understood by the East Coast and the West Coast because of various reasons. But there was a huge mass of people, a majority of the people, who did not understand because they feel that they are not something is to the detriment. So this is where we have to find our imagination, but also our proposals. We need to bring our faith, our conviction, to make sure that this question of inequalities is no longer a brake, but it becomes an engine to allow us to go forward in order to our talents and our capacities and implication in society, but also with this spirit of progress. And this spirit was killed in many of our populations, not because of globalization, but for other reasons. So the link between the two is done, and this is prejudicial to this globalization.
Thank you, Minister. So, Minister Chun, so you have in front of you, imagine the best economists which we have in this room, and also all the influential politicians, and you have to give them one message or one idea to really solve one of the biggest problems we are facing. So what will that message be?
I don't think the world's problem can be solved by gathering all the world elites in one room and telling them one thing. For a small country like Singapore, we never have such grand delusions that we can change the world by calling everybody in. But I go back to my basic premise. Even if you can gather everybody in the same room, the top leaders in the same room, will they be able to and have the courage to make new rules and political compromises? They can only have the courage to do so if they are confident that their own internal domestic base is secure. They can only be confident that their own internal domestic base is secure if they have a strong political center where they have the large bulk of their population supporting centralist policies. That means, goes back to what Michel Sapin mentioned, that means that the bulk of the people are well taken care of, not just because we have managed the inequality problem for now, but we have given the broad middle hope that their life and livelihoods will continue to improve tomorrow. If we can do this at the local level, then you will breed for confidence in the leadership to go to the international stage and say that, let's try to do more together. But if at the local level, we can't fix this problem individually, collectively, then even if we call everybody into the same room, we will still face the same problem because nobody has the courage or the means to come and make compromises. So who was it who said that all politics are local? And without solving the local issues, risking a local backlash, then there will be global consequences. So today, I don't think we need to call the global elites to come together and say that, you know, globalization is a great thing and we should all go for it. I think intellectually, they all know. But politically, do they have the means and the courage to do what is right? Do they have the political courage and means to resolve the inequality and the immobility issues that plays to the fears of their own people? And it becomes a vicious cycle. When the political center fracture, you can't have strong leaders. When you can't have strong leaders, you end up with politicians that plays to the fears of the people, and you further fragment, and it goes on a downward spiral. But to keep it on an upward spiral, to say that you have a strong leadership that can manage the domestic issues, redistribute the gains, help people to have the skills to acquire a better job, a better salary for tomorrow, and therefore, these people will support a strong political leadership that can think long-term, put the correct trade-offs on the table, make the correct decision for the good of the long term. That is difficult. That requires courage. That requires leaders to be able to convince their people that this can be done and that the future is there for us to seize. But it's not so easy. So the US problem, as Mr. Michel Sapin have mentioned, is true. It's the same problem in the UK. And I would say that in many parts of Europe, it's the same challenge. I think even in China, it is the same. Because even in China, you have the more well-developed, richer coastal provinces versus the less developed, poorer inland provinces. If you tell China to open up to globalization, the first question that everybody will ask will be, who's going to benefit and who's going to benefit more? For those who benefit less, or those who need to make the painful adjustments, will somebody help them along and give them a chance? And it's human nature. If you ask me to adjust, and I have no help, and I have no hope that having adjusted, I can find a better future, then it's human nature for me to ask, then why should I do it? I should get rid of you and bring in another person, then that gives me a more comforting message that I don't need to adjust. You will do all you can to avoid having me to make the painful adjustments. That is just human logic. So I don't think an international system will come about unless countries can be individually confident and committed to making those adjustments domestically. But of course, there are international issues that I think we should discuss. These are rules that deals with the digital economy, the financial system, how to stabilize the global financial system. This kind of things, I think we need to discuss at the international level. But even this kind of things require domestic strength to bring forth accommodation of different interests across the global scale. So it is really about the confidence of the people, the competencies of the leaders, the cohesion of society, in order for us to talk about a more connected world for the good of us all.
Thank you. Very well said. So I think in the spirit of time, I think we have to just do a quick summary of what was discussed. I think one of the things which actually came out is that inequality is something which on the ground, all the politicians need to focus to solve that. And once you are able to solve that, then you can actually do bottom up to actually solve international problems, get all the stakeholders in. And as you said, that the technology is changing the rule of the games, so people need to step back and see how do you reskill the people, and how do you set a new world order, new regulatory system, new systems which actually take care of the new technology innovation which is actually taking place. So this will take time. It definitely, I completely agree with you, Minister Chun, cannot be done in one session with one room, but it is an ongoing process, and what we are doing today through these 2 days is just a part of that dialogue. So on that note, I would really like to thank you for...
Can I just round off by saying this thing? I've always learned this. Technology is neutral. Whoever masters it wins. Globalization has pros and cons, but whoever masters it will do well for its people. So I don't think we should treat globalization as the enemy, but we should all recognize, as Minister Michel Sapin said, globalization has consequences. Then it is incumbent upon the leadership in every country to be committed to manage those consequential changes necessary for each and every country for us to benefit collectively. Otherwise, then we make globalization the enemy, and I'm not sure we will have a better outcome for all of us as well.
Thanks a lot. On that note, let me thank you guys for sharing your thoughts, and thank you to the audience.